Animals have a way of sensing things long before humans can. They pick up on subtle shifts, chemical residues in the ground, sudden drops in air pressure, and threats no human eye can see. So when 30 hens refused to step over a certain dusty path for more than 2 weeks, Amos Granger couldn't ignore it any longer. He stood near the fence, arms folded, watching the flock. The chickens scattered around the narrow trail as though it were scalding. They'd peck near the edge, then dart away with jerky, nervous movements. Amos had taken over this land only a month and a half ago, after his brother passed away. But the chickens only started acting strange once he'd moved them to this part of the property. The path itself didn't look like much. Just a bare, dusty lane about 8 feet wide, stretching from the main yard toward an old, half-collapsed storage shed. What caught Amos's eye wasn't the path's direction, but the fact that absolutely nothing grew on it. It was late spring everywhere. Else was sprouting thistles, grasses, even dandelions. But not here. This soil stayed empty, dry, and dead. Mabel stepped out of the house, drying her hands on a dish towel. At 24, she was practical like her mother, but sharp-eyed like her late father. She'd come back from the city to help her uncle sort through her family's estate, though Amos figured she was also putting some space between herself and whatever heartache she'd left behind. "You still watching them?" she asked as she joined him at the fence. He didn't take his eyes off the birds. 14 days, and not one of them's crossed it. She followed his gaze. Maybe the ground's got too much salt or something weird in the dirt. Bad fertilizer, maybe. He had thought about that. He'd even walked across the path himself, crouched low, and sniffed the earth. There was a smell, faint but strange, something synthetic, a mix between a cleaning agent and old varnish, sharp and sweet in a way that didn't belong in a field. "Gideon's coming by later," Amos said, "to help with the shed roof. He worked for Frank for years. If there's anything off about this land, he'd know." Gideon Nash had been with Frank for more than 10 years. Dependable, steady, and quiet. He knew every fence post and tree root on the ranch. Amos was grateful the man had agreed to stay on through the transition. The sun rose higher, dragging sharper shadows across the yard. One particularly brave hen tiptoed to the trail's edge, cocked her head, then jumped back like she'd been zapped. The same reaction, again and again. Amos had seen animals behave this way before around toxic streams, near dangerous weeds. There was something wrong under that dirt. "There's something in the soil," he murmured. "Something that scares them." "You mean like old pesticides or chemical waste?" Mabel asked, frowning. Before he could reply, the crunch of wagon wheels pulled their attention toward the road. A thin haze of dust rose behind Gideon's cart as he rolled into the yard. His face was unreadable as always, but when his eyes landed on the path, something in his expression tightened just for a second. Gideon stepped down and moved with a deliberate slowness. His horse, usually eager to sniff around and graze, veered wide of the bare strip and kept its distance. As the older man unloaded his tools, Amos caught him sneaking repeated glances toward the path, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating like he already knew what lay beneath that soil. He climbed the shed's ladder and got to work with practiced hands. But Amos noticed how he always kept the path within view, like he didn't trust it. At midday, Mabel brought him a cup of water. He took it with a nod, though his gaze kept drifting back toward that same strip of dead earth. After a long silence, Amos finally spoke. "You know something about that path, don't you?" Gideon stopped mid-hammer swing. He leaned back, set his tools down, and sat quietly on the edge of the roof. "Your brother never mentioned the workshop." Amos shook his head. "What workshop?" "Back around 15 years ago, Frank had a little mixing operation. Used to make pest control chemicals for nearby farms. Nothing major, but he kept it quiet. Had a small shed right there, right where that path is now." Mabel stepped in closer. "What happened to it?" "Burned to the ground," Gideon said. "Frank told everyone it was an accident. Electrical, but he wiped his brow with the back of his hand. That fire spread too fast, way too fast for wood and wiring." A cold feeling crawled up Amos's spine. "You're saying there were chemicals stored inside?" "All kinds," Gideon replied grimly. arsenic-based compounds, mercury solutions, solvent stuff that's been banned for years now, highly toxic. When it all went up, the fire burned white hot. Afterward, Frank had me help haul off what we could. But the soil, he shook his head. It soaked up a lot more than we could scrape off. Amos looked toward the path, suddenly seeing it differently. Not just a strip of dead ground, but a scar, a buried danger that the animals, with all their ancient senses, had been warning him about all along. The ground was soaked through with something foul, invisible but potent. The chickens knew it before the humans did. They clustered at the far side of the pen, feathers fluffed, pacing with unease. One rooster stood tall, his stance stiff, staring at the path like it might come alive and bite. Amos Granger watched them, unsettled. "Why didn't Frank ever tell me?" he asked aloud. Gideon didn't hesitate. Because he was ashamed. He was selling chemicals to folks without the proper permits, cutting corners for profit. When that fire broke out, he realized just how reckless he'd been. If the wind had shifted wrong that night, it could have poisoned the whole county. Mabel stood nearby, eyes tracing the stretch of dead, dusty ground with a new weight of understanding. "So, the land's contaminated. That's why nothing grows. That's why the animals won't go near it." Gideon nodded slowly. "That's what I've always figured. Frank had me haul in new dirt to cover the worst of it. But that don't fix a problem like this. You can't just bury poison and expect it to vanish." A breeze picked up, curling across the yard, bringing with it a pungent scent chemical, sweet, acrid like rotting paint mixed with hospital cleaner. Amos flinched at the smell now that he knew what it meant. It was stronger, more noticeable. Like the land itself was exhaling a warning. There could still be containers down there. Gideon said, voice low. Frank panicked when that fire started. He was trying to save what he could. But some of the drums were too heavy. He left them buried. Amos turned his gaze to the path again. If what Gideon said was true, then below their feet were corroding. Drums of lethal substances that would explain the toxic ground, the erratic animal behavior, even the subtle sinking of the earth, a sign that something underground was collapsing. It wasn't just a family mess anymore. This was a time bomb, one that could poison their well, their livestock, and anyone living downstream. That evening, Amos couldn't focus. He wandered through the house, restless, the weight of Frank's actions pressed on him like a stone. His brother had always found ways to dodge rules, to cut costs, to gamble on outcomes. But this wasn't just dishonesty. This could kill someone. Mabel found him standing at the kitchen window, staring silently at the path. "You're thinking about digging, aren't you? If there are still containers leaking into the ground." "We need to know," Amos replied. He rubbed his jaw, heavy with worry. "Our well is only 50 yards from that spot. But if we find anything, we'll have to report it. The government will get involved, test everything. They might condemn the whole farm." That was the part that gnawed at him. He had put every last dime into buying the place after Frank died. If the land was declared toxic, he'd lose everything. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. If someone got sick because he stayed silent, Gideon said other ranchers bought those chemicals. He murmured, "What if their wells are poisoned too? What if kids are drinking that water?" Mabel leaned beside him, her eyes on the same cursed path. "You think Frank knew what he'd done?" "I think he spent 15 years hoping no one ever found out." Amos turned from the window. The decision settled in his chest like a stone. "Tomorrow we dig. If we find what I think we will, we do the right thing, no matter what it costs." They went to bed early, but Amos didn't sleep. Around midnight, he heard something, a soft creak, the groan of old metal under strain. He got up, peered out the window. Nothing moved. Just the bare stretch of earth, darker in the moonlight than the rest. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Gideon arrived the next morning, looking haggard. "I couldn't sleep," he said as soon as Amos stepped out. "There's something else. Before we dig, you should know." Amos felt his stomach clench. "What is it?" Frank wasn't just selling to locals. People came from other counties, paid in cash, no questions, and it wasn't all pesticides. Some of it was worse: mercury compounds, industrial solvents, things used to process gold on the cheap. Amos stared. "Illegal mining. Yeah, Gideon said, his voice gravelly, the kind that don't follow any safety laws. Frank never said it out loud. But it wasn't hard to guess. Mabel stepped out of the house then, carrying shovels and a pick. Her expression was grim but resolved. So this isn't just local contamination, Amos said. Taking the tools, Frank was part of something bigger. A whole underground network that poisoned half the land out here. And all the evidence, Gideon added, is buried right here. The early light cast long, thin shadows across the yard as they made their way to the path. The chickens huddled together, watching, tense and silent. They seemed to know something important was about to happen. Amos drove the first shovel into the ground. The soil was darker than it should have been, slick with a strange shine. The chemical stink grew more intense, stinging their eyes. Mabel wrapped a cloth around her mouth, but kept digging, 2 feet down. Amos hit something hard, not metal, not hollow, but dense, unyielding. He scraped away more dirt and revealed the corner of a crate. Gideon knelt beside him, squinting. That's not how chemicals were supposed to be stored. Leaning cautiously over the pit, Amos spotted containers, some metal drums, others made of thick glass likely holding dangerous substances. But this was something else entirely. He worked carefully to uncover more of the wooden crate nestled in the soil. It measured about 3 feet in length, constructed from time-worn oak, darkened with age yet solid. Iron bands wrapped tightly round its frame, with no visible lock or latch. Frank didn't bury this with the chemicals, Mabel noted, watching with narrowed eyes. He hid it deliberately. Gideon's face lost its color. Amos, maybe we stop here. Let the authorities deal with this after we see what's inside. Amos muttered and wedged his shovel beneath the swollen lid. It took effort, the wood resisting until it finally cracked open with a loud pop. The contents made them all recoil. Inside were bundles wrapped in oiled cloth, stacks of old documents, and thick leather-bound ledgers preserved surprisingly well. Beneath those sat small glass vials, each one sealed and labeled in Frank's familiar handwriting. Amos lifted a ledger and flipped through it. Page after page recorded names, dates, chemical compounds, and these weren't ordinary sales records. They outlined custom chemical formulations, each described in alarming detail. Mercury amalgam, Johnson Mining. Cyanide blend for Black Rock operations. Amos read aloud, brows furrowed. Frank, what in God's name were you doing? Mabel unwrapped one of the bundles and found correspondence letters, contracts, even government inspection papers. Some had been obviously altered. He was faking inspection reports, she said, stunned. Covering up illegal mining ops and making them look legit. There's more, Gideon said quietly, pointing deeper into the crate. The vials at the bottom bore more sinister labels. Amos leaned closer, heart thudding. Concentrated mercury, emergency disposal, arsenic compound, evidence, cyanide residue. Do not test. Mabel's breath hitched. He kept everything, every shred of what he did. Now Amos faced a grim decision. Turn this over and risk destroying the lives of families unknowingly living on poisoned land. Or bury it again, keep quiet, and spare them a truth they couldn't change. The answer could define what came next. Before he could speak, the sound of hooves cut through the still morning. Dust rolled across the field as 3 men rode steadily toward the ranch. Their deliberate approach raised every alarm in Amos's gut. He closed the ledger and nodded to the others. Cover the crate, now. Mabel and Gideon threw their coats over it just as the riders drew near. The man in front was dressed like a banker, maybe in his 50s, silver-haired, eyes sharp and calculating. His companions were hard-faced, with the kind of posture that suggested they were used to breaking bones. Amos Granger, the man called as he slid off his horse. Name's Harlan Briggs. I represent business associates who dealt with your late brother. Amos kept his voice level. Frank's business ended when he did. I raise cattle, that's all. Briggs offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's the trouble. Frank held onto some property ledgers, formulas, transaction notes. My clients want what's theirs. Gideon edged closer, resting a hand near the hammer on his belt. Amos had seen him in a fight. The older man was weary and fast. I don't know anything about Frank's chemical side business. Amos replied. He left me land, livestock, that's all. Briggs' tone remained smooth but carried an unmistakable warning. Let's not waste time. Frank documented everything, very thoroughly. Records like that could inconvenience certain people. What sort of people get inconvenienced by business logs? Mabel asked sharply. One of Briggs' men stepped forward, but Briggs raised a hand to stop him. The kind who value privacy, miss. The kind who'd rather not deal with regulators poking around. And just like that, Amos understood. You're working for the mining companies, the ones Frank was shielding. I'm here on behalf of people who want this matter resolved. Quietly, profitably, for everyone. Briggs produced a thick envelope from his coat. $5,000. For your trouble, a good deal for forgetting anything you might have found. The chemical scent drifted faintly from under the coats. Briggs noticed his nostrils flared. And if I say no, Amos asked. Well, Briggs said pleasantly, I imagine ranching could get difficult. Cattle might get sick. Water might not run like it used to. Life becomes unpredictable. His tone never changed, but the threat was clear as daylight. Of course, he added, none of that needs to happen if we find an understanding. Gideon shifted slightly, letting the light catch the edge of the knife at his hip. The air grew tight with tension. I need time to think, Amos finally said. Certainly. Briggs replied smoothly, already climbing back into the saddle. We return tomorrow. And Mr. Granger, I suggest you think carefully. They watched the riders disappear through the dust. As soon as they were out of sight, Mabel pulled the coats back. They knew what was buried here. She said quietly, that means someone else knew where Frank hid it, Amos said grimly. And they're not going to let it stay buried. That night, sleep came to none of them. Amos sat long at the kitchen table, ledger in front of him. Heart and mind caught between duty and danger. Amos sat hunched over Frank's ledgers, the lamplight casting long shadows across the table. Page after page revealed just how extensive the operation had been. Chemical shipments to at least 15 mining sites spread across 3 territories. The processes those mines used should have been outlawed long ago. But it wasn't just the numbers that broke him, it was the letters, dozens of them. Desperate messages from miners detailing illness, families writing about tainted water, poisoned, livestock, children getting sick. And Frank, his replies were smooth, offering subtle reassurances, veiled promises, always with a tone of professional calm. Mabel found Amos at dawn, his face drawn and tired, his eyes heavy with sorrow. How many people do you think it touched? She asked quietly. Hundreds, Amos replied hoarsely, maybe thousands. He closed the book with shaking fingers. This wasn't about corner cutting anymore. Frank had knowingly helped corporations spread poison into innocent towns all for a paycheck. Gideon stepped into the room, already dressed despite the early hour. I've been thinking about what Briggs said, he murmured, taking a seat beside Amos. About how accidents can happen. Amos looked at him, dreading what came next. There's more to your brother's story, Gideon continued. He tried to walk away about 5 years back, said he wanted to ranch full-time, start fresh. He removed his hat, fingers tightening around the brim. 2 weeks later, his barn caught fire. Then his well turned foul. After that, someone shot his best bull. He never said it straight, but we both knew it was Briggs. A warning, you don't leave these people, not without paying. Amos felt a chill spread through his chest. Gideon met his gaze. That's why Frank kept those records. They weren't just notes, they were his protection, in case someone came for him. Mabel stood near the table, her eyes scanning the mountain of evidence. Then it's our protection now, she said, and Briggs knows it. Amos nodded. Grimly, he's walking on eggshells because he can't risk grabbing it by force. If anything happens to us, someone else might expose the truth. Through the window, the place where they'd dug up Frank's secret looked almost harmless now, just a stretch of earth, where nothing grew. But Amos knew better. That patch of dirt was hiding far more than roots. It was a burial site for years, of corruption, secrecy, and guilt. There's a marshal in Copper Falls, Gideon said, voice low. Name's Walker. Been sniffing around illegal mining setups, trying to shut him down. You think he'd want these records? Amos stared out the window. He'd want them real bad. But getting them into his hands might be the hard part, as if their words had called them forth. The faint sound of hoof beats stirred in the morning breeze. Amos turned to look. This time, it wasn't 3 riders, it was 7, and Briggs led the way. "They're not here to talk," Amos said. "Hide everything," he ordered. Back in the crate, somewhere they'd never think to look. But as Gideon moved to obey, Mabel stopped him. "What if we don't hide it?" she said. "What if we turn it into a weapon?" Both men stared at her, confused. "He thinks he's got us trapped. But what if he knew that laying a finger on us would guarantee this evidence reached the marshal?" Her idea was risky but brilliant. While Gideon sealed the original documents back into the crate and tucked it into the root cellar, Mabel and Amos copied select pages from the ledgers, enough to scare anyone who saw them. When Briggs and his men rode into the yard, Amos stood on the porch, a single ledger in hand. "Mr. Granger," Briggs called, dismounting with practiced arrogance. "I assume you've had time to consider our generous offer." "I have," Amos replied. He lifted the ledger slightly. "And I've got a counteroffer." Briggs's eyes locked onto the book like a predator spotting a threat. "I'm listening," he said. "This book details sales of cyanide and mercury to Black Rock Mine," Amos said loud enough for all to hear. "It also documents what happened next: families along Miller Creek getting sick, livestock dying, 15 households poisoned. Mining's a dangerous business," Briggs said, smooth as ever, though his hand crept toward his sidearm. "This wasn't chance," Amos went on, flipping to a marked page. "Frank wrote down that Black Rock knew the risks. They went ahead anyway. And your company saved $3,000 by skirting safety measures." One of the riders shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we ought to back off, boss." Briggs's mask slipped. His voice sharpened. "You're making a mistake, Granger." "No," Amos said. "I'm fixing one." He snapped the book shut. "Earlier today, I sent copies of these pages to Marshal Walker. Told him that if anything happens to me or my kin, he should open an investigation into every operation in these ledgers." Briggs paled. "You don't know what you've done." Amos stepped down from the porch. "I know exactly what I've done. What Frank didn't have the courage to do." From behind him, Gideon appeared, rifle in hand. Mabel stood at the kitchen window, armed as well. They weren't there to start a fight, but they weren't going to run either. Briggs surveyed the scene. His men didn't look eager to push forward. Killing these folks wouldn't stop the truth anymore, but it would trigger consequences: murder charges, inquiries, maybe worse. After a long silence, Briggs growled, "This isn't finished." Amos stared him down. "It is now, for Frank, for the families who got sick, for all of them. It's over." The riders turned and left. The 3 of them stood in the yard for a long time, not speaking, just listening to the silence, feeling the shift in the air. Even the chickens, once terrified of the bare patch, began to wander back near it, like they knew whatever danger had haunted that spot had passed. 3 days later, Marshal Walker arrived with federal investigators. The files Frank had kept turned into damning evidence. 7 illegal mining operations were shut down. 12 men, including Briggs, were arrested. Compensation followed for the victims, though money could never restore what was lost. Amos used his share to cleanse the polluted soil. Within 2 years, wildflowers bloomed where chemical drums once leaked into the ground. Mabel stayed, working the ranch alongside him, leaving her troubled past behind. Gideon lived out the rest of his days with quiet pride, knowing he'd finally stood on the right side of something important. And the land, as it always does when given time and care, began to heal. Even the chickens never hesitated again to cross that cursed patch.